Welcome to another Miami Corona Project conversation. I'm really thrilled today to be with one of my colleagues at the University of Miami, Dr. Denkova. She's a research assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the university. She's also the assistant director of Neuroimaging facility at the Gables campus, and importantly, the assistant director of research for the Mindful initiative. Dr. Denkova, together with Dr. Jha and Professor Rogers, received a COVID-19 rapid response grant from the University of Miami to examine the impact of mindfulness training on the psychological health and well-being in seniors during the pandemic. The project's goal is to identify solutions for addressing prominent psychological health challenges faced during the pandemic. And we are so happy that the University of Miami brought this team together to address the pandemic now. Welcome, Dr. Denkova.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you. I actually graduated with a psychology degree from the University of Miami many years ago. I think it was during the Jurassic period. I'm not sure exactly.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. I mean, fantastic for your degree.
But it's so good to meet you. How are you and your team? I mean, I'm assuming Professor Rogers and Dr. Jha work with you on a regular basis, but how are you doing with respect to the pandemic? How has it impacted you?
Yes, very to the point question. Yes, so I'm working in the laboratory of Dr. Amishi Jha, who is known for her research in mindfulness. And since the pandemic started mid-March, we are all working remotely, trying to adjust to this new now as much as we can, through various Zoom calls, keeping all the team engaged and trying to make progress. I know it's not easy. It's not trivial for someone who is used to go to the office and interact in person to move and work remotely. But I think for the moment, we are adjusting pretty well and trying to make progress on different fronts or ends that does not involve in-person research. And I know for some research that might be harder.
Right, there are some laboratories that do need you to play with the beakers and the test tubes, right? But even the work you do, with mindfulness, even that suffers, doesn't it, from not having the human experience, right? The research you do, right?
So once the study is finished, probably I can speak more about that. Because this is kind of our first study that we're doing completely online. So all of the participants are engaging with the trainer, it just through Zoom, not in person in a classroom, when there is, different types of interaction, when you can look also for nonverbal cues. And so definitely this will be our first experience with trying to teach and connect people through mindfulness practice remotely.
Yeah, I mean, there are, first of all, your population is seniors mostly, right? So yes. Have you seen some barriers, even in, not necessarily the nuances that you just described, the nonverbal communication, but just in direct communication because of the remote paradigm? In other words, do some seniors have a barrier to participation because they're using the technology you and I are using, or is that something that in the population you're working with, you didn't have those barriers?
To be honest, we didn't have so much barriers, and we were kind of prepared and tried to help people. So at the beginning of the project, everyone who enrolled in the project we provided them with the option to have Zoom checks with us. We guided them how to open a Zoom session, how to go to the chat box and everything. So we try to be very supportive. And our team is always logged for the mindfulness training session for people experiencing, you know, any technical problems and issues.
Sure.
And I don't think that's also related to age. You know, sometimes myself, I can have a problem if I don't have a stable connection,
Right.
or, you know, something is just falling apart and you feel kind of lost on what's happening now. 5 minutes ago, now it's this, my video, why it's not working. So
yeah, there's two parts to that question. One is just the access, and no, I think as a society, we're being more connected. Perhaps people who are more marginalized, who don't have access to, you know, to smart devices or computers, or don't have the you know, the income to even pay for high-speed internet, maybe that particular margin of our elderly population would be a barrier. But all of us are adapting. I'm teaching my course the way I'm talking to you now in a few weeks, right? So we're all in this together, right? We understand that there's a new world. But so the second question was the nuances of teaching or doing research through a little camera right here at the top of my screen. Do you, I know that there are apps for, you know, meditation. I know that there are people who listen, you know, there are a lot of ways of teaching, you know, there's whole websites just literally about teaching online and meditating online. Tell me a little bit about what you, before we get into your research and why you're doing it. I just want to talk about this new reality of ours, right? I have a sense that there's going to be a lot more happening in our world, whether it's how we get our food to how we watch entertainment, how we watch concerts, that will be in this way, at least for the short foreseeable future. And I'm just wondering if there's, in your research, if you've begun to see some loss in that. And again, that's what your research is going to find out at the end. But tell me what's missing in that calculus. What would be missing, the calculus of assessing someone from a clinical point of view using this methodology?
yes, so in our lab, probably just to start, in the lab, we are not doing so much clinical assessment. So from that point of view, I think we're kind of more privileged in that perspective. And where I think the in-person interaction matters more. In the laboratory, what we are doing is just assessing basic cognitive function, attention, working memory, and those, we were fortunate enough that last year we started a project trying to assess those remotely. And this put us in a very, we were very well positioned to move to that remote testing with this new grant. So I would say that very likely we are losing, and then there are some areas that definitely the in-person interaction is important for the research. Now what we see, so during last year, we launched a pilot just to ensure that the data that we're collecting online, given that those are like key function like attention, can people focus and do the task online from their home while they're sitting in front of their computer, compared to coming to the laboratory and then sitting at a computer and having the researcher behind them. And we saw that in general, there are very subtle differences, or people are typically doing very well also while engaging with those tasks remotely. So that's why we felt confident that, okay, now given the pandemic and everything happening, first that's the most safe thing to do, move to online assessment while still trying to gather information and move forward with our research questions. But definitely, and I think future research will show whether there are, like, in some areas, big discrepancies between the online at-home assessment and then what is happening in the laboratory.
That's useful, and just like that, I think we are entering a new world. I mean, from the way businesses will shift their way of dealing with customers to what customers want. You know, there are habits that are being formed while we shelter in place. There are new ways of interacting. From a psychological point of view, though, you know, so those are some positive things. I think there are some benefits to what's happening, right? The way we are able to be more efficient in some ways. Of course, there are consequences, and I think
Yes.
that's a lot of what you're probably studying. But tell me a little bit about what those prominent psychological health challenges that you are researching, that you're seeing. Tell me a little bit about the work you are doing specifically with COVID-19. What are you looking for, and how are you using mindfulness to help? And I guess we should start by just saying, what is mindfulness? I think that would probably be a good way of starting.
Yes, for sure. So I would say a very popular definition of mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way at that moment without emotional reactivity or conceptual elaboration. So really being present at the moment and being aware of that moment and what is happening. So that's kind of the basic. And from prior research, what we have seen is when people are undergoing stressful or demanding periods in their life, in their work, there is some kind of a degradation, you know. Increasing the stress is degrading those core cognitive functioning that I was mentioning before, like attention, memories. And those are key for everything that we do, because a small lapse in attention can have a devastating, sometimes a devastating consequences. Imagine also on the road, everything happening. Just a little lapse of attention can cause lots of problems. And we know that when people are stressed, under high load, they experience more lapses of attention. And that's where mindfulness can help and benefit in kind of a protective way from those degradations in our core cognitive abilities to pay attention, to concentrate, to remember information. And those cognitive facilities or capabilities are also important for our psychological well-being, because when we suffer from impaired cognitive control.
Dr. Denkova, the last words I heard were, when we suffer from impaired cognitive control. Are you, I see you on my video screen as frozen, but I can't hear you. Hopefully this is something that will come back and forth. The good news is that through my COVID-19, hello, okay. No worry. What I was going to say is through, and it's okay. We may even leave the bloop here, but through my COVID-19 grant at the university, I am fortunate to have two wonderful students who will be editing this video. So we don't have to worry about that bloop, or we may want to keep it as just the reality of what is happening in our world.
Completely. I mean, that's what we need to accept, that that's the reality, and we need just to move forward with that reality. Yeah. And that's it.
So the last words that you were saying, just to keep the conversation moving, you know, you were telling me about the importance for the cognitive purposes, but also that there was a psychological toll. And I think you were about to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so of course, during stressful, high demand periods, people are experiencing a burden in our feelings of overwhelming. And I think something that it's in addition to that, it's the feeling of loneliness, feeling that you're alone in all of that, or isolated from people that you are used to see. So that was also one of the key aspects when we proposed that project, especially for elderly people, for seniors who might feel that kind of isolation because they cannot interact in a similar way they used with their grandkids or their child and the visits during the weekend. So
is that population in your research also seeing the obvious vulnerability as a high-risk population, and also the lack of access? Some people feel more comfortable going and wearing a mask. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a point, like it was at 7 a.m. where the elderly would shop at Publix, and then later. So are there special characteristics or nuances within this population that you're also researching and exploring, besides the very obvious isolation, which would happen without the pandemic in a lot of elderly lives, but again exacerbated by the mandatory distancing that they must endure?
Yeah, no, for the moment, the focus of our research is really on their cognitive vulnerabilities, because as I said, degradation in cognitive functions can also exacerbate or lead to worse psychological health outcomes, as well as isolation. So feeling of loneliness, changes in the moods, those are the outcomes that we are targeting. And that's why also the program is called Connect Now, because during those 2-hour sessions every week, people can connect with their trainer online. It's not in person, but they're still connected with other people and with the mindfulness trainer. And I think besides what we are trying to accomplish in terms of researchers, I think from the human side, that's also an important achievement, being able to gather people together and lead them through mindfulness practice together.
What is
so
that?
there is no alone in the story, or alone is kind of dampened down.
So is there a way of either role playing a little bit or actually doing a little bit of that process so that people can understand what this mindfulness experience would be like? Or is it sort of impossible to do in this short time frame? Can you describe what the trainer takes the elderly person through?
Okay, so I can just, because it's also, still an active project, we have one more week to finalize everything.
Sure.
So I would say that generally the program is for 4 weeks, and with a 2-hour session every week. So typically that was happening on the Saturdays from 9 to 11. And we had a first initial group, and we did that also for a second wave or for another group. So typically what is happening is that the trainer has some kind of a schedule or topic for each session, and each session touches base on different core mechanisms or aspects of mindfulness practice. I'm just giving the more general one is focus attention. So being able to focus on the breath, and every time the mind starts to wander at something else, to gently bring it back to the breath. So that's one core mindfulness practice, and it's part of one of the sessions. So, and during the sessions, just to talk about a little bit about the schedule of the sessions, the trainer is starting with a quick mindfulness practice and then moving and discussing some topics that are related to that practice. And so it's a very nice blend between explaining the purpose of those practices, practicing mindfulness together, guided by the trainer, and then discussion around the practice and the experience of that practice.
And the goal is that for the following week, that person would be able to apply some of this as they're enduring stressors, clear stressors, the ones I just talked about, in their lives as a way of again, reducing that anxiety and moving forward. And then you have a way of evaluating the success of this, because I'm right. That's what you're doing. That's the research behind it.
Yes.
If there's something for the audience that isn't in your study that they can take away from this, because of course, you don't have to be an elderly person in your lab study to be experiencing the things that you're talking about. How is it that, when you are literally worried about social distancing, and you're worried about your income, or you're worried about a family member or beloved one who's acting differently than the way you would want them to, and these are real concerns, what does mindfulness, or whether you're going to take your kid to school or not take your kid to school, every worry, all the uncertainty, the absolute uncertainty that exists right now, what would you recommend to the audience who's, again, not into mindfulness, has never taken a session? How do you get them to incorporate some of this in their lives? Is there a place where they can learn a little bit more or do something?
Yeah, so definitely I mentioned those sessions with the trainer, but in addition to that, they have assigned homework, if I can say so. So they're provided with mindfulness practices and asked to try to practice at least every day for 10 to 15 minutes, because that's what our research is showing, that the key to see improvement in any domain, like being the cognitive or psychological well-being, depends on how much people practice. So that's a very important aspect. And it's a more, like PT, it's something that needs consistent. If we can apply it in our daily life, this can help us gain clarity. And I think that's kind of the purpose. We can pause for the moment, because sometimes there are periods that it's very chaotic, everything that is happening. We need to make sometimes quick decisions or hard decisions. And I think in those moments, sometimes what is good is to give that space, or to pause and allow the space so that we can gain some clarity, at least in our minds, and move forward.
Yeah, people don't really realize that everything is your brain.
Yes.
Everything is your brain. Every sound you hear, everything you experience, every reaction. It's how your brain interacts, how your brain acts, not interacts, acts, how your brain brains. Everything is your brain. And I think through mindfulness, what you're trying to do is just sharpen that tool, the only tool we have to do anything with, so that we are better prepared, so that we don't act irrationally or impulsively or are clouded in our judgment. And that's what mindfulness brings to the equation. And I do believe that in times like this, where there is so much chaos and so much noise and so much anxiety, that helping this tool understand how to get that information, how to react to it, or block it or do whatever it needs to do is important. So I so appreciate the work that you as one of our colleagues are doing at the University of Miami, and particularly with this population. I think Florida has 27% of its population as elderly. We are the state that has most elderly on it. So the research that you're doing specifically on this issue with a pandemic that, until there is a vaccine, will force the seniors to continue staying sheltered and farther away from society than other populations who may advance and take hopefully measured risks, small little risks, intelligent risks, but will go out, will go to the workplace, will go shopping. So as that happens, I see the value of mindfulness. Have you seen the impact of the psychological stressors, the toll that it's taken across Miami-Dade County? Have you been able to assess how this pandemic has impacted the broader community?
No, the focus of our research during the pandemic was mainly trying to provide a mindfulness training to seniors, and then assess the impact of mindfulness training and their practice, as I mentioned, because that's a key component of it, on any changes in their feelings of isolation, mood being positive or negative, and cognitive ability. So that was kind of the...
Sure, that was your focus. But assuming that there's widespread anxiety and stress in the community, what recommendations would you make to, if it's not premature, if you rather wait for your research before making any recommendations, but generally, are there any recommendations you would make to the county now so that they can improve the situation now, today, as we are the epicenter of this pandemic globally?
Yes, so I think you said very nicely that our research is trying to sharpen our minds, because that's the tool that we have, and that's the tool that will allows us to be better and feel better. So definitely, I think one aspect is for those who never tried, to give it a try and try some mindfulness practices, because really it's important. And I know when it's chaotic and everything is going in a speedy and chaotic way, people cannot pause. But I think sometimes that's what we need. We need some space between us and what is happening, in order to gain that clarity in our mind and calm down. And I think another aspect that is important sometimes, and it's part of some mindfulness training program, is acceptance. Mm-hmm. I think at that moment, it would be a waste of our time, energy, and resources to go and fight ourselves, if I can say so, or our enemies. It's better to accept the situation as it is and trying to move forward with that.
Are there any lessons that we have learned during this particular pandemic, which we are nowhere near out of yet, that can help us prepare for future pandemics? Is there anything, not about what we can do now, you just gave us some advice on that, but what we can begin planning for so that when the future pandemic hits, we're a society better prepared, or a future crisis?
Excellent and very hard question. So definitely, I think there are some ways of preparing, and probably I will just make a parallel. I don't know if it's out of the scope of your question, but I think most of the time what we are doing, we are always trying to deal with the problem when it emerges, or treat a disease when the disease emerges. And we pay very little attention on the prevention plan. So I would say prevention and trying to strengthen different prevention programs, not only about the psychological, well-being, but let's say for kids that have problems in school. So everything that we can do on the preventive side, that will help not only for a eventual or a future pandemic, but I think in general in life. Taking more the perspective of how we can prevent and bolster some aspects in our well-being and behaving, so that it's less likely the problem to emerge.
Well, Dr. Denkova, thank you so much for taking time with me this morning to engage in this conversation. I can't wait to read about your research when you're done with it. And thanks for everything you and your team do to advance us here in this community and to develop new knowledge that can be applied in the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all right.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, it was great. It was great. Thank you. Bye.
Nice. Bye.